In this video, we're going to talk about how I compose my paintings using my 3-pillar framework. Composition can be difficult because there's so many things happening at once. You have to think about where objects are placed in the scene, how you position the camera, whether through an overhead shot, dramatic close-up, or a point of view shot, and how to draw attention to your focal point with elements like perspective, lighting, or color. But instead of trying to memorize a long list of composition rules or depending on the same compositional formula, I want to break it down into just 3 simple principles that are way easier to understand and apply for yourself. By the end of this video, you will also have a practical study guide with exercises you can use to improve your compositions and a summary sheet outlining the 3-pillar framework so you can look back on it while planning your own artwork. So let's begin. Hi, my name is Shami and I've been making digital art for over 6 years. I taught myself everything I know through online classes, so I know how overwhelming it can be to learn art completely on your own. So here on this channel, I wanted to compile everything I've learned into comprehensive and easy to understand art tutorials taught the way I wish I had learned them. So welcome to the channel and let's dive in. The word composition can have lots of different meanings, as we saw before, but it can be boiled down into a single concept: clarity of message using design. What are you trying to say, and how can you say it in a way that both makes sense to the viewer and looks pleasing? As we discuss the 3 principles, we will keep coming back to this idea of clarity of message using design. So let's begin with pillar number 1, leading the eye. The quicker your viewer can read the image, the more powerful your composition becomes. A weak composition can lead to confusion and disinterest. So how can you make sure your audience is able to quickly understand the painting? A person's visual field can range from 180 to 220 degrees, but the area where we see with most clarity is only about 2 to 3 degrees. Because of this, our eyes do not take in everything clearly at once. They move around, collecting small pieces of information that our brain then uses to understand the whole scene. So when someone looks at the painting, they're not reading the whole image with equal attention. Their eyes constantly searching, jumping from one area to another, deciding what matters. As artists, our job is to guide that attention towards the focal point and reduce the unnecessary noise competing for it. And we can do that pretty simply with the use of arrows. These arrows can take many different forms, but can be broadly classified into either shapes or lines. Let's begin with shapes. Shapes in a painting are essentially masses of value. These masses of value have a quality of force, which can push the viewer's eye in a certain direction. Take this painting, for example. These shapes all push your eye in this direction. To determine the force of a shape, you can use the edges along the long axis to sort of average out the direction of the force. One idea that helps me is to imagine the shape as an arrowhead. If this shape were pointing somewhere, where would the rest of the arrow go? This helps you stop seeing it as just a shape and start seeing it as a directional force that can guide the viewer's eye. You can practice this by drawing your own abstract shapes and determine the direction of their force. The more you practice this, the more instinctive it will become. Another way to use shapes as arrows is to place your focal point in the middle of a shape so as the viewer follows the directional force, they will end up at the focal point. And here's an example by James Runnels and another by Edgar Payne, where they place the focal points within a singular shape so your eye easily goes from one focal point to another by following the passage of value. Now on to lines, which are more direct and obvious in their force than shapes. Lines can be either physical or implied. Physical lines are the ones you can see, such as perspective lines, gestural lines, or objects with a linear quality, like walkways or scaffoldings. Implied lines are ones that we do not see but still follow, like a person's gaze. We are psychologically wired to look where someone else is looking, and this can be a powerful tool in our composition to help guide the eye. It's important to note that these arrows that we add, whether lines or shapes, do not all need to point toward the focal point. Some of them can be used to lead the eye around the image to look at the other interesting elements in the painting. What matters is that there's a hierarchy of interest to follow, where most of the arrows point to the focal point, and then from there, you have a few to lead them around the image and then back to the focal point, ensuring that their focus never leaves the frame. You can study from master artists and analyze how they use shapes and lines to draw attention to the focal point and lead your eye around the frame. This will help you apply the same concept to your own paintings. On to the next pillar, which is about space. You've probably seen compositional rules like the golden ratio or the rule of thirds. Many people use these because they tend to work really well. Following rules like these are a safe approach that often leads to a dynamic and interesting image, but your paintings will begin to look like the same compositions over and over again, and they'll become predictable if you're using the same solution for every idea. So instead of treating these rules like fixed formulae, let's look at why they work and use that idea to make composition choices that actually fit our painting. Let's look at these two frames. I've broken up both using just two shapes. Which one looks more interesting? How about three shapes? I'm gonna guess that you chose these two. Why? People are wired to see visual change. We're drawn to contrast because contrast creates difference, and difference tells us that something is more important than the other. We look for contrast all around us: large against small, upright against flat, or light against dark. Now, how does this idea apply to the rule of thirds? When we use the rule of thirds, we're placing the focal point along one of these 4 points, and this will break up the space into large versus small sections, which look more interesting and dynamic than something placed in the center. But that doesn't mean that placing something in the center is wrong. It all depends on the message you're trying to say. Having an uneven breakup of space can be used for images where you want to emphasize action and tension. But on the other hand, dividing your canvas into more equal parts can help portray a mood of peace and tranquility. When you understand why the rule of thirds works, you no longer have to rely on the same layout over and over. You can take the concept behind it and apply it in a way that actually supports what you want your artwork to say. Moving on to the golden ratio. This compositional rule works because of the same principle we just discussed: contrast. There's difference in the size and number of shapes, and the real world is full of this kind of variety. Any city will have tall buildings beside smaller buildings, a field will have flowers at different heights, and a beach is always scattered with shells of different sizes. So everything you see is made up of lots of different size shapes. And the size tends to be indirectly proportional to the number, meaning that as the size of the shape gets larger, its quantity decreases. We tend to have less large shapes and many more small shapes around us. This is often called the big, medium, and small principle, or BMS. It works because it gives your composition hierarchy. When everything is the same size, every shape competes for attention, and the image can start to feel repetitive or a little boring. But when you vary the size of your shapes, the composition feels more intentional and interesting to look at. In most paintings, smaller shapes tend to be focused around areas of importance, where medium and large shapes are placed to help frame or lead your eye to the focal point. You can study this by looking at master artwork and analyze how they break their artwork into big, medium, and small shapes, and then do mini compositions in just 3 values with a hard edge brush, so no opacity, and focus on breaking up the frame into an interesting combination of big, medium, and small shapes. This helps you build a muscle memory of shape variation, and is an exercise I often do where I feel my composition needs more variety. On to the final pillar, which is the design of contrast versus harmony. This one is the most abstract of the 3 and is incredibly subjective and difficult to explain, which is why I saved it for last. But it's also extremely important because it's what makes compositions unique for each artist and helps you stand out in the crowd. In the previous point, we talked about how difference or contrast can make a composition more interesting or appealing because of its variety. But at the end of the day, no matter how interesting a composition may look, it still has to serve the message of your painting. If every area has strong contrast and everything is fighting for the viewer's attention, then they won't know where to look and the message you're trying to communicate can get lost. Contrast only works when it's placed against quieter areas. A bright focal point feels stronger and bright when the surrounding areas are dark. A sharp edge stands out when it's surrounded by softer edges, and a color looks more saturated when it's up against neutrals. So in a way, contrast needs something to contrast against. If everything is loud, then nothing is loud. That's where harmony and organization come in. They create the structure that allows your moments of contrast to actually stand out. How we design the contrast versus harmony for each painting is completely up to us and our preferences and style. But it revolves around the idea that you want to put more contrast around your focal point, and if you have multiple focal points, then you give contrast to them in order of importance. To begin with, as a foundation, you can use the fundamentals to design the contrast versus harmony. The fundamentals I think are the most important are value, shape, gesture, form and perspective, space, color, and edge. You can control the contrast and harmony in your paintings by manipulating any or all of these fundamentals. Let's analyze some paintings to see some examples. Here we have one of my portrait paintings. My focal point is the eye on the right. I make it my focal point by using mainly value, color, and edge. If I turn the image to grayscale, we see that one of the areas of greatest value contrast is right here. since we have the lightest value right next to the darkest value. I also wanted to use color contrast, so I have a very saturated red right beside these dark saturated blues. These hues are opposite each other on the color wheel and therefore have hue contrast. Lastly, I painted some of the hardest edges around the right eye and slightly softer edges elsewhere, so it would seem that the right eye is more in focus. I wanted to harmonize all these kinds of contrasts with shape design, with these repetitive fan shapes and circles. There's also a harmony of color hue since majority of the image is in the blues. Let's look at a more classical painting by John Singer Sargent. Here we have a scene with two girls, and flowers, and lanterns, and leaves, and grass, and branches, and it could easily become noisy and chaotic, but this painting is anything but. So how did he organize all of those different elements into a single frame? One of the first things I noticed when I saw this image was how these flowers were arranged in a line across the image. And then I realized there was another line of flowers here, and the lanterns also formed a line. So there's a harmony of these horizontal gesture lines that organize how all these different elements are placed. You also have these vertical gesture lines with the girl standing, as well as with these branches and grass blades. To me, the focal point seems to be this girl and the lantern she's holding. I say this because she has the clearest silhouette in the entire image, so she has strong value contrast and edge contrast to stand out. As you can imagine from these examples, there are an infinite number of ways you can design the balance between contrast and harmony in your painting. And this is something you develop over time by studying master paintings, analyzing the choices they made, and building your own preference. So the next time you see a painting with a composition you like, try to break down what makes it interesting. Why did you like it? Was it the way the artist used lines and shapes to help guide your eye around the frame? Was it how they broke up the space using big, medium, and small shapes? Or was it how they designed the contrast versus harmony throughout the image using value or color or shapes? The more you notice these concepts in other paintings, the better you'll be able to use them in your own work. You can use the study guide on screen to help you practice these ideas. And the summary sheet is in the link in the description so you can look back on it while planning your own compositions. If you like this 3-pillar framework, then you'll definitely like this video where I explain the most important art fundamental in less than 5 minutes and how it can help improve your art. Thanks for watching.